welcome everyone. I'm Tom Burton. I'm the publisher for the Mandarin, and today we've got a live webcast. We're exploring the whole issue of the modern regulator and the impact on regulation, but much more on regulators, of the fast-moving economy. As we know, technology and globalisation is really driving a rapid change in the environment, and all regulators, not just in Australia, are challenged by these changes. So today we want to explore that proposition and try and hear different perspectives. Today we've got Delia Rickard, who's the Deputy Chair of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. Welcome, Delia. We've got Claire Noone, who's the Principal Consultant at Nous Group, and was formerly at the Victorian Department of Justice, where she was Acting Secretary there, Deputy, and has worked quite extensively through the Victorian bureaucracy. And we've got John Stanton, who's the CEO of the Communications Alliance. John represents the telco and communications industry and is a very active player in the regulatory space and has been around government for many years. So we've got a very mature panel here. We'd like to discuss it. We'll be running for roughly 40 minutes, and this broadcast will be available later on for those who can't stay the full 40 minutes. Today, everyone will be speaking on their own behalf, and what do I mean by that? That the comments should not necessarily be taken as reflecting the organisation's position, and it's an important piece to make up front, that these are observations on behalf of people who are professionals in the field, and they should not be seen as necessarily reflecting those changes. Claire, you recently were part of an article we had at the Mandarin where we, I suppose, kicked off this conversation, and we started understanding, well, what were some of these challenges. From where you're sitting, what are you seeing in the broader economy that's really impacting regulators and how they're working?
Yeah, I think there's broadly three areas, Tom, that are emerging. The first is about convergence, and the second is what I've called emergence, and the third is really around creation. And so in relation to convergence, we've already seen a big convergence of banking, telecommunications, utilities, for example, and supermarkets are now banks and insurance companies, phones are now banks, and so we've seen a big shift in industry. We're increasingly seeing that the distinction between things like electricity generation, distribution, retail and consumption, all those distinctions are becoming less clear, and as all these distinctions become less clear in the marketplace, the particular regulatory regime that applies, for example, to banking or to insurance or to telecommunications becomes less relevant or less clear as to how it's going to apply in these emerging industries or as this convergence occurs. And with that, we've actually had a fair bit of experience of how to deal with that over time, and I'm sure both John and Delia know a lot about that and have a lot to say about what we know about that. And one of the things I'm thinking about in terms of ideas is how is what we know about what we've already done in those spaces and how we've dealt with convergence and regulation that needs to apply in that context, how we've dealt with that and what have we learned from that over the last 10 years that we can then be thinking about and applying to the second area, which is that of emergence, and particularly the emergence of the collaborative economy, which we've seen really interestingly across a broad range of domains that we've seen this in: auction sites, accommodation, errands and odd jobs, ride sharing, and now financing. So where we've seen convergence in these industries, we're now seeing actually the sharing economy or new peer-to-peer type of models emerging, and how do they fit into the regulatory regime, and then how is that going to actually affect the way we regulate and design. So I think that's a big challenge. We've seen it quite a lot with Uber and how that has challenged both regulatory models and regulatory thinking. And the other thing I think that we've really got to start to think about is creation of new products, things like driverless cars, and how are we going to think about regulating driverless cars, how are we going to deal with robots? I mean, I don't know what that means yet for how the community is going to be, how services are going to be provided, how services are going to be purchased, but what's the impact of that potentially? And things like drones. You know, if we just think about how we regulate drones in terms of how we regulate airspace now, is that going to be the right sort of framing? So one of the things I think is a big challenge is there were two challenges, and we'll talk about this over the period of this webinar, but one is about how do we make sure we design regulation that is flexible and able to respond as these things change rather than the big lag we're seeing at the moment. And then also how do regulators use the current framework to actually respond to these changes as they occur, and in large part before the regulatory framework itself catches up. And I think they're both big challenges that that we're facing in this space with what I think are really major changes, largely driven by, I might say, by technology.
Thanks very much, Claire. That's a very comprehensive answer, and I think obviously covers a wide spate of topics there, which we'll explore during this webcast. Delia, from your perspective then, you know, as a sort of opening proposition, what do you see the challenges from, you know, for regulators more generally as these rapid changes occur in the marketplace?
Oh, thanks, Tom. Look, I just take Claire's three themes. First of all, around convergence. Convergence isn't new. It's been happening for a long time. And I think the main thing to focus on there is quite a practical problem, is ensuring that there aren't regulatory gaps. And regulators are used to this. They're used to doing cross-referrals of powers. So, for instance, but a lot of legislation, such as the ACL and the Competition and Consumer Act, they're economy-wide, so they're easy to apply. Where you've got carve-outs, such as you do for financial services under the ASIC Act versus the Australian Consumer Law, then what happens is regulators talk to each other, do referrals of powers. The same will be required for the Ombudsman schemes, and those are things that are practically being discussed and worked through now. So I think they're just common-sense solutions there. In terms of emergence in the new economy, sharing economy, these are challenges for regulators, and I think the important thing for regulators here is to be proactive and on the front foot and say, to be conscious of what's coming at us and to start to look at it and think, well, what are the implications of this for competition? What are the implications for this in terms of consumer protection? So we've done work, for instance, recently around the sharing economy and what are the issues that it throws up there. And it throws up issues. It's very dependent upon online reviews for its legitimacy, trust. It's an innate part of the business model. So we'll start to put out messages now about what our expectations are about the responsibilities of platforms to ensure the integrity of the reviews they have there. There'll be different responses for different problems, but I think the important thing for a regulator is to understand what's coming, to look at it, not to stand in the way of innovation, but see where there could be real issues and then think through, well, how with this model can we work with industry to stop those issues actually occurring. Creation of new products, again, you've got to get that balance right. You never want to stifle innovation. You do want to look at things like product safety and what are the safety implications of things like driving cars. And I think what's important there from a regulatory perspective is the conversations you're having. Being conscious of what's coming, understanding it, talking to industry about it, what their goals are, how it works, and asking the questions around issues such as safety, privacy, whatever the issues that are thrown up. So you're thinking through those as part of a conversation with the community and with industry that's developing these new tools, products, etc. So you can get to a situation where everybody's comfortable and you don't have real consumer product safety, for instance, concerns.
Right. Thanks, Delia. John, you're part of an industry that, you know, famously is being converged, I suppose, the communications industry more generally. But from your perspective, looking at it from an industry that's been traditionally regulated, how do you see the sort of market disruption occurring? Obviously, it's already hitting you as a business, but how do you navigate through that from a regulatory perspective?
Well, you're right. The disruption comes in many forms in the telco sector, and while there's no cast iron template as to how to deal with it. I think in most cases businesses will start by looking at what's the commercial impact of the disruption, what's it doing to their customers and to their bottom line, and understand that first. Examples in our industry, it may be something as simple as a high volume of BitTorrent traffic by online pirates driving down the network quality for all the other customers, or it might be streaming video, which is requiring additional international capacity in circumstances where the carrier doesn't derive revenue from it. It could be elements of difficulty around migrating customers onto the NBN. Plenty of examples. So companies will typically look at what short-term fixes they can put in place to try and ameliorate the impact, and at the same time think about longer-term commercial strategy to deal with the situation. But at the same time, of course, they're going to be looking at whether there are existing regulatory or legal tools available to help them deal with the situation. And in many cases, they will find there's a regulatory gap. Not surprising, given the dynamism of the market and the way that new services are coming over the top of regulation that was designed for legacy services. And then in that circumstance, it's really a question of, well, how does the regulator view that situation, and if they agree that there's a gap, how agile can they be? How quickly can they move to put in place a fix? And you could argue that the existing regulatory framework in Australia is not always as agile as perhaps it needs to be in this different set of circumstances we now face.
Right. I suppose that's probably the elephant in the room, isn't it? Is the regulatory structures and processes agile enough? And I think Cleve indicated some observations on this. The question would be perhaps to you is, do you think that if you like, the traditional model, which is very much a big policy agency and then a separate independent regulator, and then that takes a fair bit of time to get regulations through and change, etc. Is that fit for purpose, or we've got to start rethinking that process?
Yeah, I think both Delia and John have alluded to a couple of the problems that we face. The first is for policy makers. You're quite right, Tom, that actually seeing a problem emerge and then actually dealing with it through legislative change it's easy enough to identify where the regulatory gaps might be, but then to say how do policymakers actually have and design flexible regulation that enables you to be able to respond to that in a much quicker way. And maybe that goes to not having such technical regulation, or if it's going to rely on, as Delia said, sort of cooperation, is there a better way to actually design regulation itself? And how do we think about that? Are we thinking about when we're looking at new markets and emerging markets, are we actually rethinking, and going a bit to your point, John, about there's new products have emerged which we try to fit into a legacy framework, instead of actually perhaps thinking about, ought we actually still be regulating this market at all as a preliminary question, and then if we should be, then how should we be doing that? And I don't think in terms of policy and regulatory policy in this space, we're actually asking that, what I think is sort of quite a fundamental question. So that is one of the challenges. The process itself is also another part of the challenge, and that is, often and we talk about having the conversation with the community and having the conversation with industry, but quite often the whole process of regulatory reform is an adversarial process, and that is that incumbents who are in the industry are seeking to prevent change and reform to the regulatory framework because it suits them as incumbents in large part. And on the other side, consumers or workers or unions in safety, for example, are saying as you change or reform, particularly to a deregulatory or self-regulatory model in new environments, you're reducing the protections. And so actually for governments to achieve regulatory reform in that context of changing markets and changing products isn't an easy task. And somehow I think we might need to be changing that whole paradigm and making it, having a different concept or understanding or underlying paradigm about what is the approach, and having a different conversation and a different engagement with industry and with consumers and the community about what should the shape of regulation be, particularly where there's a new proposition. I think there's also a big challenge in this for regulators, and I think both Delia and John have alluded to this as well, which is how do you actually independently exercise your regulatory discretion within the current regulatory framework, which is possible to do while the policy catches up, but at the same time meeting the community expectations about using the current instruments, as John alluded to. So I think that poses a challenge. And I also think, speaking of the Westminster system, I think there's a challenge for government itself, because government in large part has a zero tolerance for risk, and there are going to be things that go wrong, and you can't regulate out either by the regulatory design or by the regulatory practice the potential for something to go wrong, whether it be, you know, in the travel industry, a travel agent going broke, whether it be that a product does get onto the market that is unsafe and ultimately ought to be off the market but was on the market and caused some harm. There's got to be, in that sense, an understanding that you can't regulate out all potential harms, and that some harms are going to occur, and how you sort of don't have an intolerance for risk altogether from a political perspective, and creating the context for the regulator as to exercise their independent discretion that allows for that tolerance of risk.
Right. Delia, just from your perspective, obviously Claire's laid out a fairly broad sort of set of issues there. How are you seeing, if you like, the design issue, the Westminster design issue? That's a big question, but what's your observations from what Claire was just saying?
Look, there are a lot of issues in what Claire was just saying. I might start with the risk one. Yes, there is a low tolerance for risk, but I think the reality of the modern regulatory world is there's not the resources or the capacity to deal with every risk. So what most modern regulators will do is look at issues and do a risk assessment and work out where they fear that the most detriment could be if they don't act. And so there's a constant sifting through of issues to say, well, what are really the most important issues, what are the ones which cause the most harm, and to focus resources there. I think there's also a recognition, this covers a couple of Claire's points now. I don't think it's true to say that there's no appetite at all for failure. I think there's a recognition now that when you're thinking about new regulatory regimes, from light-handed disclosure, such things, to more heavy-handed, it's really worthwhile piloting things these days. And the whole behavioural economics movement and the work that's being done out of the UK Cabinet Office and is now happening here in PM&C is really championing the need to pilot change, to say, well, does this work? And probably my overarching statement on all of this, and there's two other points I want to make, is when you're doing policy, I think the question you need to start with is, what's our goal? Where do we want to end up? And how do we get there? And in getting there, Claire's correct, you will often end up with an adversarial process. But if, in fact, you set out your end goal, in my experience, if you then get all of the parties, be it old industry, new industry, consumer groups, public sector, and put them in a room together and get agreement around the outcome, then it is a lot easier to get there when people are having the conversation with each other and working out how they can get to a satisfactory outcome than everyone coming into the regulator or the policymaker giving them their views and those views being synthesised to an outcome without that constant dialogue happening between all the parties. It sort of makes me think of the old Hawke days when he put everyone in Parliament House to bash out a solution. And when you do it that way, I think you'll find you'll have a lot less adversarial process, and what's more, you'll come to a solution that is more win-win for all parties concerned.
Right.
But do you think we're doing that, Delia?
So I couldn't hear you, Claire.
Sorry, I said, do you think we're actually doing that in terms of both policymakers and regulators in fact having that dialogue? Because I think you're advocating exactly what I'm saying, which is we actually have to start having a different approach, which is a dialogue approach.
I think we're doing it more and more. I think if you look at some of the financial services reforms of late, in almost all of them, you had multiple round tables where all the parties were in the room, were saying, you know, this is where we need to get there. How do we get there in a way that causes least cost to industry, but that provides the appropriate level of consumer protection? And often, you know, the policymakers and the regulators would be the quiet ones in the rooms. The others would be going back and forth. If you do this, this will happen. So it doesn't happen all the time, that's true, but I think more and more it's the default.
Right. John, from your perspective, I think if I'm hearing both Delia and Claire talk about an outcomes approach, if you like, how would you see that working from your perspective? Is that something you think is a good, you know, from a broad end? I'm not talking about the telco industry specifically, just broadly from an industry perspective. Do you think industry would be supportive of a more outcomes approach? And I suppose the second question is, how does that work in practice, given a lot of regulators have very prescriptive powers and often don't have a lot of flex to play in that sort of broader outcome approach?
On the first question, I think, at least among my members, yes, they're very supportive of an outcomes-based approach to regulation. And the main reason for that probably is that they feel that can produce a better outcome for customers. Because it can lower costs, but also it can enable, you know, a more precise and intelligent response to the needs of customers. So yes, we're certainly in that camp, and we come from an industry that is characterised by very prescriptive, very detailed regulation. And as to your second question, how do we make that work? Well, I'm not sure I yet have the answer. We've made an attempt recently to move down that path, and frankly, it wasn't successful. Back in 2014, we pulled together a team of the ACMA, the Department of Communications, as it was then, and ACAN, the consumer representative group in this space, to put together something that we called a customer information obligations framework. That's to say, within the consumer protection codes that we have, there is a lot of prescription about how telcos have got to communicate to customers, what information's got to be provided, when, with what frequency, whether it's pushed or pulled, you know, the nature of the content, the nature of the medium, and we genuinely believe that a less prescriptive approach would provide a better outcome for customers, because it would enable the communications flows to be tailored so that customers were getting information they wanted when they needed it, as opposed to you know, a constant barrage at times of information they don't necessarily want at that time. And we succeeded after about a year's effort to agree a framework with the regulator and with the consumers and with the department, and we're very pleased about that. And we took that as the tool that we needed to reform the Consumer Protection Code, the TCP code as it's called, that was registered by the ACMA in 2012. And while some reform was achieved, essentially we found that when we tried to apply the principles of this framework and go for an outcomes-based approach and remove duplication and remove prescription, while still retaining the essential, need to achieve an outcome that's beneficial for the consumer, we ran into a lot of headwind. And Delia, I'm sure will want to comment on this because we're involved in discussions around all of these topics during this process. So we came away from that exercise feeling that we certainly hadn't moved to an outcomes-based approach, and although we had from at least one agency, an explicit agreement that was the way we ought to go, when it came to walking the talk, it wasn't as successful as we would have liked.
Right.
Tom, and just say something for a moment. I won't go into the code, but I would make a number of observations, because if you work as a regulator for a long time, you see the debate constantly shift between principles-based and extremely prescriptive regulation. And I certainly work under both regimes. I think we'd all agree that principles-based is the ideal. And there's a lot of good principles-based legislation out there that works very effectively. I think the prohibition against misleading and deceptive conduct is probably one of the most effective pieces of drafting of all time and can capture a multitude of sins. What we find, though, is the prescription comes in for two reasons. It comes in because industry is asking for more guidance, which is really quite a common event for us, that you'll have a high-level thing and the industry will want you to spell out, well, step by step almost, what do I need to do to comply with that? Now, you don't necessarily have to do that through legislative guidance. You can just do that through issuing practice notes, etc. The other way you end up with prescription is where you have a history of misconduct in certain sectors where, as the regulator, you feel you need to be more prescriptive, or the policymakers feel they need to be more prescriptive because the high-level principle has not resulted in good conduct, and therefore you do get more directive about what's expected. Where conduct is good, there's no need for that.
Right, right. Claire, I think you're indicating in the environment area that outcomes seem to work. Why do you think it's perhaps worked in the environment space? Is there lessons to be learnt from that?
Yes, I think so, but I think it also goes back to Delia's point, which I think is a good point, is that it can work where there is, if you like, a desire to comply and a desire to achieve the outcome on the part of industry. And in that sense, where there are some incentives for it to actually see that compliance with the regulation, which is in the environment space, I think is probably more evident, where you can actually see that, and it's established through research, that compliance with the environmental regulation helps with your sort of community mandate, but ultimately is seen to be good for business in terms of the bottom line, and therefore has the lesson, I suppose, is that if there is the opportunity to benefit from compliance with the law and be able to innovate, and so firms have been able to find an appropriate way to meet environmental objectives and the outcomes that have been specified for that by actually doing new things and doing things in a different way. But that's because it contributes to the overall bottom line. And so I think from a social responsibility point of view and an economic point of view, there is seen to be a benefit from that perspective.
Yeah. One of my experiences in media regulation, in fact with our beloved Prime Minister, was when he was a lobbyist or a lawyer for the Nine network, was a huge reluctance to have any discretions available to government. They're much more comfortable, and to be fair to him, this was an industry-wide view from the broadcasters. They were much more wanting to have definite laws that they could work with, that they understood the edges of, and that was it. And there was a big reluctance about having discretions at the front end, if you like, for regulators to be able to take more sort of judgmental propositions. And I think that, in my mind at least, reflected, this sort of, if you like, Dixonian culture we've had in Australia, relatively strong culture of black letter law. So I don't know what people's views on that are. John, I might just come back to you. Have you got any observations on that? At a bigger level, you've worked in Canberra, you understand the system. Do you think the system's ready to give those sort of discretions and more, outcome focus, if you like, to regulators?
Well, I'd like to think so, and I mean, I think that the government has, to its credit, been looking at some of the tools for doing that. The Productivity Commission, I think, did a very good job in designing the regulator performance framework that's now in place. It's in its first year, and it provides specific KPIs, if you like, for regulators as to how they ought to achieve outcomes. And to their credit, the ACCC and the ACMA have both taken that process very seriously and put together their sort of self-assessment criteria and had them approved at the ministerial level. And we'll see what comes out of that process over the next 12 months and beyond. It provides for industry review of the performance. So I think that's certainly a step in the right direction. There are examples where regulators have taken a flexible approach. When our Consumer Protection Code came in 2012, the ACMA, I think, did the right thing. They said publicly, well, we understand that there's a lot of new requirements in this beast, and it will take time to comply, in varying amounts of time for varying players. But what we will do is tread softly, in the initial period, and we'll focus on education and assistance towards compliance. And we will tell you when that honeymoon period's over, and at which point we will be willing to come down like a ton of bricks on industry. And by and large, that process worked reasonably well, I think. It wasn't formal forbearance, if you like, but it was a transparent message that says, well, we're going to help you for a while, and if you haven't tried to help yourself, then you're going to be in trouble.
Right. Delia, you got any observations?
Look, I think what John was just describing is the norm now. Whenever you have a new law, you'll have a transition period before it kicks in, so there's time to change. Then the regulator will inevitably say, we were not planning to take action for the next 6 months to 2 years, depending upon what the issue is. We'll issue guidance about what our expectations are and work with industry around compliance, and then give warning about when we will start to take regulatory action if we see breaches. So I think that's really become the norm for the way in which things work these days.
Right.
I was also going to say, just go back to the beginning of what John said, there are a lot of checks and balances on regulators. So regulators don't have unfettered power. They have pretty limited resources, so they think long and hard about what they're going to focus on, and they will focus where they believe that there is real harm. And even when they're doing that work, I mean, their goal is to get good outcomes for the community. They have to report, as John said, under the regulatory performance framework. There's ombudsman overseeing us, there's estimates, there's admin review, and there's judicial review. So there are a lot of checks and balances in place over the regulator.
Right. Claire, I just wanted to come back to this issue. I think you talked about it, about these fast emerging technologies and changes. I think, is it Volvo are saying, look, they're going to have a driverless car out on the market next year commercially. Right? And I think the state of California has already started putting out some draft regulation around driverless cars, much to the chagrin of Google. They're saying, look, we think it needs a driver. But how do regulators get a chance to look at some of these business models and test some of the, if you like, the technologies and business models when they're moving so fast? I suppose the provocative proposition is, do we need a sort of incubator for regulators to be able to go in and test some of these ideas around how you might be able to work with some of these very fast-moving business models before they're so far down the track that you're really playing catch-up forever and ever?
Yeah, I think Delia alluded to this a bit in terms of sort of pilot and thinking about things. But I do think that we often don't have time to actually think about what's coming and what's on the horizon and think about the options. And I think quite often we start with, this is the current regulatory paradigm, if you like, and this is the current regulatory framework in which we are going to have a look at regulating driverless cars. So we bring all of our sort of understanding of regulating car driving and traffic, and the question we don't ask is, should we start with a blank piece of paper as it relates to driverless cars and say, actually, let's think about this differently and afresh, and say, let's think about, if we've always had driverless cars, what would our regulatory framework look like? In part, I say that because if having a driverless car and it has to have a driver, I'm not quite sure of the point of having a driverless car, but be that as it may. So I do think there is some opportunity for trying to be able to think afresh outside of just making current regulatory frameworks apply to new things. It's actually thinking about how do we think completely differently with an idea that says, how should we regulate driverless cars in a new paradigm rather than in the same paradigm? Does that need an incubator or some other way of thinking about it? Perhaps it does. You know, perhaps looking at things, is there a new school of behavioural insight in as sort of form of emerging incubation and thinking around new regulatory models for new technologies that don't come from and maybe this is part of it, don't necessarily come from legal, aerial, us and them base, but come from a much more collaborative place, community benefit place. What are the real harms? So maybe it's a whole new way of thinking about it.
Right. And Delia, given these are global issues you know that we're typically playing with, how do regulators keep up with that global play and get that sort of observation and experience from other regulators?
Look, there's a range of global networks that regulators can tap into, and more these are really coming into play. If I look at the consumer protection side of things, for instance, there's the OECD, so you now have global recourse networks and global sharing of information when there are problems with products. And really, we all want to leave the safe products alone, and you just really don't want to know where are the problems, where do we need to be focusing. So as we become more and more of a global marketplace, that is essential. Certainly one that I participate in the International Consumer Protection Enforcement Network, each time that group gets together, there's a lot of focus on what is the technology coming our way and thinking about, well, do we need to be concerned about this? Do we need to go back to TORS and sort of get the blank piece of paper, or is this something that we really don't think is going to cause any problems? And I often think of what do they call those white hackers? I'm not quite sure of the term.
Ethical hackers.
You need those for you know, in the driverless car space. You need people with the sort of technical knowledge, etc., to sit down and think, well, where can this go wrong? What are the particular potential problems? Are they going to be adequately addressed by industry, or do you need regulatory involvement? And ideally, you have those conversations before accidents occur and before tragedies. And that's the challenge, to really split your resources so that you've always got to focus on the proactive to the future, identifying their problems before they emerge and putting in place mechanisms to stop them, as well as your day-to-day bread and butter reacting to things which are out there and happening.
Right. And John, just to come back to you in terms of the international play, the telco space has had big global coordination arrangements for a long time through the ITU and others. Do you see that that's got to change to be more effective, or what's your observation about the global coordination piece?
That's a tough one, because just as regulators may struggle to be agile in the face of, you know, of rapidly moving disruptors, yeah, so may the international telco community. You know, if we look, for example, at the Internet of Things, which is probably the next huge disruptor rolling down the track towards us, there is both an absence of an agreed standard and a surplus of standards that apply in different cases. You know, the ITU, which is the traditional place for most of this coordination, is looking at the issue. In the meantime, various standards have sprung up around the world, and it threatens actually to limit the potential and the utility of IoT-based networks around the world. So, I think that there probably needs to be work done to figure out whether the traditional ITU model is itself, able to cope with the speed of market change.
Yep. And one observation I'd have is, and don't freak about this, John, we don't have a Department of Internet of Things. There's no focused policy group that I'm aware of that is looking at this issue in a cohesive, structured sort of way. We've got various agencies, and this is the problem. These new phenomena often arrive and they straddle multiple agencies and multiple regulatory frameworks. And maybe I'll just come back to you, Delia, just the last point. How do we sort of, you talked about this, I think, in your opening comments about the coordination piece, but how do we get that coordination working better so that we can, draw those dots more effectively?
Look, it is, as John said, a constant challenge, but I think you'll find that the government's sufficiently agile that where there's a problem that straddles multiple departments, they will get together a group of representatives from all of there to talk to work through the issues. So we don't all sit in our little silos and not speak to each other. And the Internet of Things will be one of those things. I mean, often you'll find with any of these new things you're going to have privacy issues, you're going to have safety issues, there will be technical specification issues, because you want them not using a million different languages. So you do have to come together and talk, and I think ideally those conversations don't just happen within government, but they happen with industry, with also user groups, so that you're dealing with it together.
Right.
Tom, if I could, actually, there is a good example here, because the Comms Alliance last year created an IoT think tank, which has now morphed into an alliance that's got about 150 participants in it, and they include at the Executive Council level the ACCC, who we invited to be part of that conversation, the ACMA, Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, a whole range of industry groups, as well as large corporate entities. And we recognise that to deal with that disruptor, there is no question that we need a united industry government approach to it, and that's what we're trying to create through that IoT alliance.
Right. I'm just having trouble here. Just 1 second.
Yeah, it kind of looks like we lost you.
Yeah.
Visually, anyway.
Could I just then make it, while we haven't got Tom, that one of the themes that's come through our discussion, John and Delia, is that this idea of really a new approach or expanding the current approach in terms of policy design and regulatory policy design in particular, that makes it a much more collaborative approach with industry, consumers, government, sort of all getting together to actually design the regulation, I suspect in quite a different way than what we're doing at the moment in terms of government consulting with rather than collaborating with. Do you think that's right? Or is that an observation that comes out of our discussion?
I think it's an ideal, and I'm very comfortable with that sort of approach. And not all problems need to be addressed by legislation. I mean, you'll have times when there are the right incentives in place for industry to fix problems, where they want to, and particularly with new technologies, is a great example. I find that industry self-regulation works well where industry wants to build trust or avoid regulation, and then there are the incentives to do it well. And with both those situations, where they will work with users, they'll work with government, and it can work very well. At other times, that process will hopefully get to a consensus.
Yeah.
But if it doesn't, at the end of the day, that's the job of government to make those final calls. But a process leading up to that, such as you've outlined, I think is going to work well.
Yep, all right. Claire, I'll just let you finish if you like. Have you got any overall observations just from our discussion?
Well, I was just saying, Tom, while we didn't have you on the air, that one of the things that sort of emerges from the discussion is really a new approach to regulatory policy design in terms of a much more collaborative approach of industry and government and consumers or others that says in designing it's not just the role of government, it's actually the role of everyone to, not the role of government just to consult, but also that we need to rethink how we actually do regulatory policy design in terms of that whole collaboration and commitment from everyone. And that, I think, is something that has been evident in our conversation today.
Thank you for that. Well, thank you for that, and I'm sorry I dropped out there. My computer went to sleep, which is not what it's meant to do. Thank you very much, everyone, coming together. There is as I observe government in lots of spaces, this collaboration piece keeps coming back, in lots of different frameworks. And if I was going to sort of reflect on that just as a final observation, I think that's our big challenge, how the sort of sophisticated part of government, and I call that certainly this piece, the discussion, and the sophisticated part of industry and consumers, work together in a much more, industrial way. It's not just in the regulatory piece; it's in service design and it's in policy development, obviously. And I think that's our big challenge. And I think all of us, this is a good representative group from that. But that would be my observation from it. So. All right, well, look, thank you very much for that, and hopefully everyone's got something out of that, and we'll be back on this subject again. So thank you very much, John. Thank you very much, Delia. Safe travels to London. And I think Delia actually mentioned in the preview for this that there's a new issues paper out for the Consumer Law Review. You can get it off the Treasury site, and it actually covers some of these issues, about pages 50 to 60 if anyone's interested in it. So that's a good example where I think the system is starting to get quite proactive and looking at some of these very issues. So welcome to get that off the Treasury side or through the ACCC site. So thank you very much, and good afternoon.
Thanks.
Thank you.